afternoon, and welcome. My name is Latanya Jones. I'm Director of External Affairs at the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, also known as DORIS. DORIS houses the city's municipal archives and library and is focused on fostering civic life by preserving and providing access to the historical and contemporary records of the New York City government and its people. Thank you for joining us for this month's Lunch and Learn Educated for Freedom. I'll quickly introduce today's speaker and then pass it to her to begin the presentation. Dr. Anna Mae Duane, Professor of English, is the Director of the University of Connecticut Humanities Institute. She teaches and writes in the fields of American Studies, African American Literature, and the medical humanities, and is particularly interested in how definitions of youth and childhood shape culture and policies in ways that require losing one's rights in order to claim care. Anna Mae has authored or edited 6 books, included Educated for Freedom, the incredible story of two fugitive schoolboys who grew up to change a nation. She also discussed the roles young people have played in history at Salon.com, Slate.com, and on the Children's Table podcast. Dr. Duane?
Thank you so much, Latanya, and thank you to Monica and Melissa and everyone at Doris for this kind invitation and for the work that you do. Okay, so I am going to share my screen and adjust. And if it's not working, I'm assuming someone will yell out. So I'm assuming that we're good to go, and I'll just get started and just say how delighted I am to share my own work on this part of New York City history. And to be honest, the way I came to write this book, I feel is a bit of a New York story on its own. If you can't tell from my accent, I was born in the Bronx, and I'd returned to attend Fordham University, where I set about writing a dissertation on children's role in early American history. And one day in the 90s, right, a long time ago, I headed down to the New York Historical Society on what, really had to be called a fishing expedition. I didn't really know what I was looking for, and it was, to be honest, it was even harder to locate children in the archives back then than it is now. We just child was not a sort of a category that would show up a lot in finding aids. So I sort of wandered around, and I stumbled on a literal catalog card with the words that said New York African Free Schools, 1787 to 1834. And I was surprised and intrigued and unsure of what I was looking at. An African free school, 1787, what did that mean? Was it possible that there was a school accepting African-American students so soon after our nation's founding and so far from the national law that outlawed slavery nationally in 1865? So I went and I requested the records, and I sat there, again, not sure what I was going to see before. And again, this is the 90s, so it was a microfiche machine. And so I was slightly nauseous from the spinning mechanism and the shaky script. But pretty soon I was completely absorbed in what I was reading. And the first thing that I remember coming across was a skit performed on an examination day in the 1820s. And that's a sketch also from student records on the left there. And this is just a bit of what that sketch involves. So it's two students, assuming they're on stage, greeting each other, how are you doing? Why are you going to school so early? William asks him, I'm not going yet this long while. James responds, this is your pleasure, William. That may be your pleasure, William, this is mine. And William's like, well, it's not altogether my pleasure either, James. For I've been teasing my mother for my breakfast for some time, and she says, no hurry, child, no hurry, and sends me to play a little longer. And William is saying, well, it's not altogether my pleasure. is no hurry. And then James responds, well, I love to be obedient to my parents, and I know it to be my duty, but I really think that if I could not get my breakfast in time for early school, I should run off without it. For half an hour study over my sum or any part of any other exercises at school is of more consequence to me even than my breakfast, and he is cut off. Right. I've tried that, James, but I find that even if I adopt that plan, I may go without not only my breakfast, but my dinner also. For although my parents are perhaps as kind and indulgent as any parents can be in other respects, yet in this they seem to take but little concern. And James now is officially sort of taken aback. You both please and distress me. I am pleased to find that the later hours at which you are noted to going to school. So, right, we know this is a pattern for William. It's not your fault. And at the same time, I'm greatly distressed to hear that your parents, being so much older and who ought to, and William stops him. Stop, James. I can't hear a word against my dear parents. I can excuse them because they have but little learning themselves and don't know the value of it, nor do they know how much time it takes to make one a good scholar. And when I came across this document, I was hooked. The message was clear from the skit. The progress that these students were aiming for required separation from one's own community and family. From what I could see, they were being taught to dismiss the very people who had secured their freedom, their parents, in favor of the rules and values of their white schoolmaster and administrators. And I wanted to know what it was like as a 9-year-old child. I found out later there were 9 at the time of the skit. What it was like to stand on stage and talk about how your mother, and by extension the other mothers at the school, were too lazy or too ignorant to understand the great importance of getting to school on time. And in the years since I saw that skit, I've been told many times, and I might even be reminded again today, that that's the wrong question to ask. We can't ever know how any historical person really felt. And in this case, the evidence makes it a really, really difficult question to ask, and much less answer. These are children. These are Black children in a slave nation. They're reading words for them written by adults and performing them at a performance at which they would be judged. As I've researched the work of the school, the lives of the people who attended it, I've realized that the historical and literary documents offer ample proof that these children and others like them, young, disempowered, and barely visible in a lot of records, were key parts of broad conversations about the nation, about power, about freedom, and yes, about education. And they led me to a series of other questions that resonate throughout the book and arguably for many New Yorkers today. When do you stay and fight? When do you leave to seek opportunities elsewhere? How do you build and sustain community in the face of constant discouragement or displacement? After all, right, to return to the evidence, which in this case was the skit and school records, it was not just a classroom exercise that someone happened to write down. These children were performing publicly for an audience that included community members, powerful benefactors, and national journalists. It took place on examination day, which was a regular event, at least once a year, I think sometimes twice a year, that showcased the work of the children for the public. And these are just a few examples of some of the schoolwork that was produced and probably shown on examination days and other and just shared with the public in various ways. The bulk of the records that we do have from examination days were held at the New York African Free School number 2, and most of them are between 1818 and 1824 or so, though there's some that falls outside those parameters. Most of them took place at and they are really beautiful pieces of work, and the New York Historical Society has collected them as a collection. It's called Hope is the First Great Blessing. If anyone's interested in sort of seeing some of this schoolwork up close. And the bulk of the school and the bulk of the materials that I've researched deal with one of the New York African Free Schools, number 2, the Mulberry Street School. There's an engraving of it by one of the pupils, and there's just a sense of the neighborhood. Just to give you a little bit of background about the schools, as I mentioned, they were first created. The first one was in 1787, set up by the New York Manumission Society, which was included members like Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. As New York City moved towards the year 1827, the year in which any remaining enslaved people in the state would be emancipated, the stakes could not be higher for the students of the school, who were the first generation of Black New Yorkers who would all step into freedom at the same time they entered young adulthood. The boys and girls who attended the school weren't just pupils, they were living data points in an ongoing experiment testing whether education could truly create equality, even as pro-slavery voices insisted that Black people were locked in a permanent state of childhood. So there was intense attention paid to what they learned, how well they learned it. Members of the press attended this and testified to the work of these students as evidence in a national debate. And this is just one quote among many from the Commercial Advertiser. Those who believe, wrote a journalist in the Commercial Advertiser, quote, that the African race is so far inferior to whites as to be incapable of mental improvement, would not require any further testimony to the unsoundness of their opinions than to attend an examination day performance, end quote. So again, the stakes are extremely high. Now, again, I didn't know any of this when I first came across the dialogue. I also didn't know that the student in question, the one who is always on time, was real-life star student James McCune Smith, whose own mother had emancipated herself from slavery and supported him through school. I also hadn't realized that the alumni of the school read like a who's who of great Black abolitionists. James McCune Smith, who I've already mentioned, was the first African American to earn an MD. He was also the author of the preface to Frederick Douglass's second autobiography. Another alumnus is Henry Highland Garnet, whose parents had orchestrated their family's escape to Maryland. As an adult, Garnet would travel the world and would be invited to speak in the Capitol on the 13th Amendment. Ira Aldridge would be the first American of any race to perform a lead Shakespearean role in London and spent much of his career in Europe as a Shakespearean actor. Alexander Crummell was an incredibly influential activist and missionary. And if you're interested in the school's later development and the later life of Henry Highland Garnet, I highly recommend checking out Eric K. Washington's earlier Lunch and Learn right here on Doors. I was doing some incredible work on that topic. But my book and what I'll be thinking about today is focusing on just two of the remarkable students who met and learned at the Mulberry Street Schoolhouse, James McCune Smith and Henry Highland Garnet. And as I studied them, I realized their lives would be shaped by the tension between staying and leaving, between loyalty to community and the promise of progress. Both, as I've already mentioned, would grow up to become influential leaders, but they took very different paths in their quest for Black freedom and success. And just as a note, my sources for the book included the school records at the New York Historical Society, a published history of the school published by the schoolmaster in 1830, many collected letters to and from these men and their networks, and their extensive publications in the press. Neither of them, to my knowledge, and if anyone knows differently, please tell me, but neither of them wrote a book themselves, and neither of them have an archive dedicated to them, though I think they both should. And I'd just also like to mention I'm incredibly indebted to the work of John Staunton, who has collected the writings of James McCune Smith and written on him as well. Okay, so through these stories of these two men, I believe we can trace how Black New Yorkers transformed spaces meant to constrain them into sites of resistance and achievement. We can see how they built networks of mutual support that sustained them through repeated attempts at displacement. They fought against slavery and racism throughout their lives in many forms. They also wrestled, that's what I was going, with the controversial assertions of the American Colonization Society, which often gets short shrifts in large overviews of the abolitionist movement and the anti-slavery movement, but was quite a influential force. The ACS argued that there was no remedy for the racism and prejudice African Americans faced here. Thus, the best solution for everyone involved would be to facilitate a mass immigration / deportation of African Americans to Liberia or other places in the globe. So let's go back to the beginning and talk a little bit more about these two subjects and how they faced these dilemmas. James McCune Smith, whose presence in the opening skit takes on deeper meaning when we understand that his story is the son of a self-emancipated mother, would sort of place him as a child who was always indebted to his mother. And as a side note, they lived together to pretty much the end of her life. Friends would recall how hard Smith worked, both sort of to sort of keep his household afloat as a child and on his schoolwork. They would recall him, this was a quote, holding a Latin grammar in one hand while working the blacksmith's bellows with the other. And at school, James was a star student. His work appears more frequently in the school display books than any other students. In 1824, at age 11, he experienced what was an incredible triumph. He was chosen to welcome the Marquis de Lafayette, who was making, a return tour of America, which gathered incredible crowds across the whole country. And I think it's really worth pausing on that moment. A 11-year-old Black child, one generation removed from slavery, but technically still enslaved himself because by the law, they wouldn't have recognized his mother's self-emancipation, standing on stage and welcoming one of the great heroes of American liberty. The school preserved at least 3 complete copies of James' welcome address, clearly recognizing its symbolic power, and that's one of the copies there on that slide. But the school's ongoing celebrations of Smith's achievement came with a cruel twist. As the years progressed, the school became more affiliated with the American Colonization Society, explicitly telling students that they should be trained as missionaries for Liberia and promoting the idea that there was no future in the U.S. for New York African Free School students. And this is just one example of how that message was conveyed. This is the published history of the school, published by Charles C. Andrews in 1830. And in this moment in the text, the schoolmaster tells the story of Isaac, who also was an exemplary student and a really hard worker. And he tells the story, there's just a glimpse of it here. He goes everywhere, he gets turned down, he gets fired because of his complexion. And again, eventually he resigns himself to go to Liberia instead. And at first it seemed as if James McCune Smith might face the same fate. After graduating from school, Smith's brilliance seemed perhaps destined to only earn him disappointment. He applied to both Columbia College and Geneva Medical School, but they both turned him down, quote, on account of his complexion. The message was clear: no matter how well Black students performed, certain doors would remain closed to them. There was another promising Black medical student, John Brown, who did study at Columbia, but he was never officially considered a medical student, and he was never awarded an MD for his work. Yet, Smith would transform this roadblock. With support from Reverend Peter Williams in New York City and the broader Black community, he secured the opportunity and the funding to study medicine at the University of Glasgow, which then and now has an incredible reputation. And here, I think, was perhaps one of the first indications that this star student had taken decidedly different lessons from what his teachers taught, and what they thought he would absorb from his recitations at school. Whereas Smith's schoolmaster had insisted Black children could only advance by permanently separating from their communities, Smith left home only to return it. He would left home only to return there. He would use his Glasgow credentials not to escape his community, but to serve it. And one of his first public actions upon returning from medical school was to set up a pharmacy. But publicly, he called out the medical malpractice that was harming children in New York City, particularly at the newly established, what would be called the Colored Orphans Asylum. And in the first year of this asylum, there were about 30 children taken in, and 9 died in 1 year, which was really quite shocking. And the asylum's doctor, who himself was a white man and a colonizationist, wrote up the report attributing the deaths of the 9 children to, quote, the peculiar constitution and condition of the colored race, end quote. In other words, he was asserting that Black children could not thrive on free soil. Smith responded with a blistering critique in the press, using scientific evidence to refute the doctor's claims that Black children somehow couldn't thrive in the North's free climate. And within a decade, James McCune Smith would serve as the head physician at the asylum, attending to the health and education of scores of children housed in a substantial building on Fifth Avenue and between 43rd and 44th Street. This is 2 different depictions of it. One of them is 1847, and one is sort of a memory of it a little bit later. But as you can see, they're quite impressive buildings, and the location is quite incredible. So Smith's determination to return and serve his community stood in stark contrast to what his schoolmasters had expected. But his path, finding opportunity while maintaining deep ties to New York, was just one of the challenges that he and his colleagues and his schoolmates faced. For instance, his schoolmate Henry Highland Garnet would confront pressures to leave his community even under more harrowing circumstances. While Smith chose to go abroad for education, Garnet's scholarly displacement came not by choice, but by force. There's Henry Highland Garnet. So we'll start from the beginning with him, just to give us a sense of where he's coming from. His time at the New York African Free School was this product of a dangerous escape from the only home he had ever known, which was a slave plantation in Maryland. At age 9, he and his entire family had a harrowing escape from that plantation, eventually making their way to New York City, where they settled on Leonard Street, forging close bonds with neighbors like the Crummels, whose son Alexander became Henry's close friend. They would remain friends throughout their lives. And they would often recall walking together to the Mulberry Street school through often hostile streets. Now, I've been through the records. I've never been able to find anything in the examination day records or even the school records featuring Garnet. And I think it's quite likely, I'm pretty sure that these performances were a privilege doled out to favorite students then as now, right? If you get to be in a school play, it's a privilege for students that are doing well by the teachers. And I think that Garnet's rebellious streak, which, as we'll see, emerges very early, may have disqualified him for some of those roles. James McCune Smith later on, in a memoir about Garnet, described him as quite the opposite of the nice, good, quiet little fellow in whose mouth butter wouldn't melt. Rather than seeking praise or acceptance from the authorities, Garnet early and often and always focused on resistance. As an early adolescent, likely about 13, Garnet organized his fellow students into political units. They would meet after school, planning for a future in which they would lead those still enslaved to freedom. Along with Cromwell and other schoolmates, Garnet's group made 2 bold resolves. They would refuse to celebrate the 4th of July as long as slavery existed. And when they completed their education, they would, quote, go south, start an insurrection, and free our brethren in bondage, end quote. At age 14, Garnet learned a brutal lesson about the precarity of Black life in New York when he returned home from a sea voyage to find his family's home ransacked and his family missing. As you recall, they had escaped from Maryland, and slave catchers had come calling, forcing his parents and his sister to flee. His sister was actually detained for a while, but was eventually released. The home they had made had been attacked and threatened with dissolution at a moment's notice. Young Henry's response to this was to take a clasp knife and head to Broadway in the hopes of confronting the hated slave catchers. Right? Again, we see this instinct to stand and fight. But his family, in the aftermath, prioritizing his safety, worried that he would draw too much attention to himself, sent him away to Long Island, where he would have an apprenticeship. And again, so once again, he's torn away from the home he knows, this time taking outside the border of the city he loved and the friends he had made. While he was away from home, he would injure his leg so badly that it would eventually require amputation in his adulthood, a painful and dangerous operation in an age without reliable anesthetic. He would attempt to continue his education in New York City through several different means. None of them worked out. But then word goes out that there's an academy, Noyes Academy in Canaan, New Hampshire, that is admitting Black and white students for higher education. So Garnet, Alexander Crummell, Thomas Sidney, and all of whom were New York African Free School students, sign up and attend this academy. From what we can tell, Garnet stands out there. He's incredibly charismatic. He has a book of poetry that unfortunately is lost that people would gather around to hear. He's asked to give speeches to local gatherings and anti-slavery societies, and impresses everyone immediately with his oratorical power. But they only had a few weeks or months at their studies before an angry mob of locals used nearly 100 oxen to physically drag the school building from its foundation. They literally, accounts say they lifted it into a swamp. Here is a painting of that account of just picking up the school and literally ripping it from its foundations. Right, and it just, the scene grotesquely echoes his childhood experience of displacement again, violence tearing away the ground beneath his feet. And I would point out that once again, Garnet stands and fights. Friends later recount how, even though he was quite sick himself with a fever, Garnet spent the night of this attack molding his own bullets, and he fired them to keep the mob at bay. They credited Garnet with saving their lives, but nonetheless, safe, they still had to return to New York City. So neither Smith's nor Garnet's path to adulthood was simple or easy. Right? Even as Smith had advocated to stay and build and was doing so successfully, his position at the Colored Orphans Asylum forced him to witness how vulnerable Black children remained. And there's accounts of Smith himself having difficulty sometimes coming into work because he would be denied access to the streetcars because of his color. Garnet, for his part, would spend years in relative freedom overseas in the UK, raising anti-slavery funds, and eventually in Jamaica as a missionary, only to grieve over the loss of friends and neighbors suffering back home. As the years went by, the ideas of colonization and immigration became even more fraught, especially within the Black community. And just to give you a sense of one of the most stringent sort of opponents of the ideas of the African Colonization Society, Frederick Douglass, spoke up often about this. This is just one of the examples. Shame upon the guilty wretches that dare propose and all the countenance such a proposition. We live here, have lived here, have a right to live here, and mean to live here. He was unequivocal. And his strong opposition would bring him into conflict with Henry Highland Garnet several times, as Garnet was not quite so sure that the best path for African American freedom and success was to stay in the United States. For instance, when Garnet is in Jamaica, he puts an ad in the paper recruiting strong Black workers to come and join him in Jamaica and be doing the strong work there. Again, Douglass takes him to task in the press, saying, Garnet is one of our greatest, and we need him here with us, right? We do not want this brain drain, right? We need Garnet here and fighting. And then we'd go back and forth about this quite often. And right, once we get to 1850, the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act makes these differences even more sharp, even more painful. Every Black New Yorker, regardless of their birth status, now faced the threat of being claimed as a fugitive of labor. So Garnet, after his time in Jamaica, returns to the States, but he remains committed to the idea of emigration, and he creates his own society for this purpose called the African Civilization Society, which causes dismay and anger within the community. And just to give one example of how painful this was as people were struggling with the choice he was posing, in 1860, there's a public meeting where records tell us 1,200 New Yorkers gathered to, quote, pass judgment on Garnet's organization. George Downing, who also was in New York African Free School, so these are all schoolmates, but now really duking it out, literally. George Downing calls Garnet a convicted liar. And he calls the society an auxiliary for the Negro-hating colonization society. So really harsh words. Garnet, now never one to take insults lightly, lunges at his old schoolmate, and they had to shut off the lights. The meeting ends in chaos. So this is just a really painful point for Garnet and for the friends he had gone to school with as they're trying to figure out what is the right path forward, including James McCune Smith. In the printed aftermath of a disastrous public debate, Smith pleads with, quote, our friend Henry Highland Garnet not to drive us out, for you will not lead from our chosen field of battle. Garnet strikes back, accusing Smith of sort of forgetting where he came from. He said, we both had to fight from the Mulberry Street schoolhouse to the City Hall Park, sprinkling our hot young blood among the streets of New York. And he accused Smith of forgetting his roots, pointing to the mansion being built on 6th Avenue. In Garnet's eyes, it was Smith who had betrayed the schoolboy pact to fight for equality by opting for comfort and wealth. Your conduct in this matter, he wrote to his old schoolmate, is perfectly consistent with Dr. Smith, the autocrat of the West Broadway drug shop of 1861, but it is very unlike James McCune Smith of 35 years ago. And by the spring of 1863, things shift again. Garnet is ready to focus on recruiting Black soldiers for the Union Army, right, to fight here for freedom. And Frederick Douglass, who had bitterly criticized Garnet on several places, now is standing next to him in his own Shiloh Church in New York City, where he was the pastor, recruiting alongside with him, saying it was time for retribution. However, at this time, the New York governor had refused to allow Black men to join the state's regiment. And if you wanted to join, you had to go to Massachusetts to enlist. You couldn't enlist in New York. And instead of accepting Black volunteers, Governor Seymour implemented the deeply unpopular Military Draft Act, which told white New Yorkers that they were required to report for military service or pay a $300 fine, which was nearly a year's wages for most working people. And that decision would prove explosive. Both Smith and Garnet had lived through the riots in New York City in 1834 and 1835. They both knew how quickly summer heat could ignite boiling resentments. And on July 13th, 1863, their fears were realized when hundreds of angry white New Yorkers attacked the draft office, setting off 3 days of violence. The mob's early targets revealed their true motives. They went not just after government buildings, but Black children, heading straight for the Colored Orphan Asylum within hours of the first unrest. And again, just to give you a sense of what the school looked like before the attacks. And the scene was terrifying. 500 rioters surrounded the building where over 200 children were under the care of just a handful of staff. And what happened next was both heartbreaking and miraculous. The asylum's matron and the other staff members quickly gathered the children, most under the age of 12, and attempted what seemed impossible, a 10-block walk through streets filled with murderous rioters. Witnesses described an extraordinary moment when, quote, the human mass swayed back as though impelled by an unseen power. Somehow, not a single hand was raised against the children as they made their way to the police station for safety. But their ordeal was far from over. The station house was already packed with other people seeking refuge from the violence, and they were there for 3 days and nights. Meanwhile, across the city, rioters were creating incredible havoc, inflicting incredible violence on Black New Yorkers, killing, beating, terrorizing men, women, and children. The Colored Orphan Asylum, which Smith had worked so hard to build into a model institution, would be destroyed. A smoldering symbol of how quickly racial violence could erase even the most established Black institutions in the city. It would eventually be moved to other locations, but it would never be again on Fifth Avenue and 43rd Street. So the riot had once again shifted the landscape of New York City and assigned new meanings to the landmarks that had shaped the lives of and choices of both Garnet and Smith. The orphans' 10-block walk through hostile streets recalled the dangerous journeys both Smith and Garnet had made themselves as schoolboys. The police station, which had been a site of oppression where Garnet's sister had been detained after his home had been ransacked, now was a temporary sanctuary for hundreds of Black New Yorkers. The community's response to this crisis revealed both the strengths and the limits of different strategies for survival. Garnet, who had long argued that Black people needed to seek safety elsewhere, nonetheless took on the role of gathering information and overseeing aid distribution to the riot's victims in order to begin the process of rebuilding. Meanwhile, James McCune Smith, who had spent his career proving Black people could prosper in Manhattan, suffering from congestive heart failure, found himself forced to relocate to Brooklyn after the riots. But the riot had brought about a change in policy and the creation of a Black New York regiment, with Henry Highland Garnet leading recruitment efforts and advocating for the soldiers. Throughout the winter of 1863 and 1864, Garnet walked almost daily on his wooden prosthetic leg through snowy New York streets to administer to Union Army recruits facing dangers that eerily echoed his past as a child. Just as he had once fought off man-stealers as a 14-year-old, he now found himself advocating for the release of teenaged boys who themselves had been dragged off to Rikers Island by unscrupulous recruiters. So that you had those children who were there, but in addition to the volunteers who had wanted to be there. So Garnet was there to sort of advocate for fair treatment, for pay, to make sure that everyone was indeed a volunteer. On March 5th, 1864, the city would be transformed once again. The 20th Regiment of Colored Troops left Rikers Island and marched through the streets to a grand reception in Union Square. Onlookers spoke of the marching columns of Black recruits resplendent in, quote, their soldier-like appearance, the evenness of their dress, and the carriage of their muskets, and garnering an ovation. Garnet himself followed the chief of police and 100 officers down Broadway to South Ferry and took his place on the platform before the Union League Clubhouse on 7th Street in Union Square with his wife, Julia, sitting alongside some of the city's most wealthy and powerful citizens. The troops stood before the platform, waiting to be formally addressed by, among others, the president of Columbia College. And I just find the accounts of how the soldiers responded themselves really moving. The Tribune reported, quote, a vast crowd of citizens of every shade and every phase of social and political life filling Union Square and surrounding streets. Every door, window, veranda, tree, and housetop was peopled with spectators and who cheered for the recruits. This don't look like July, which was when the riots were, remarked one soldier to another. Another man, clearly thrilled by the huge shift between the warm reception on this early spring day and the hatred that had stalked the streets the previous summer, called out, "How are you, rioters?" James McCune Smith would later recall the sense of emotional whiplash that permeated the celebration. For him and for his community, who had spent who months earlier had, quote, been mobbed and hunted down, now to be cheered along these same streets was a turn of events, he said, that, quote, put ordinary miracles in the shade. Like so many in the crowd, the president of Columbia College, Charles King, felt that this was a turning point. No, no, my friends, he said to the man standing at attention before him, you cannot be hindered in your high calling. One need only, quote, look back for a few years, nay, but for a few months in this city, to realize what a forward step has been taken and to feel quite sure that in such a path there is no step backward. While prejudice, indeed the rancorous hate of brutalized minds, may still throw obstacles in your way, that way is upward and onward, and your march cannot be stopped, end quote. This triumphant march of Black soldiers through Union Square marked a profound transformation, once again, of New York streets, the same streets where Smith and Garnet had fought their way to school, where Garnet's family had fled across rooftops to escape slave catchers, where Black orphans had been forced to evacuate their burning home. Yet even in this moment of victory, it carries echoes of the fundamental questions that had divided these two remarkable schoolmates. Could true freedom be achieved on American soil? And I'll end by saying that the debate between Smith and Garnet, between staying to build institutions despite resistance or seeking liberty elsewhere, speaks to larger questions of freedom and belonging that resonate at this moment. At that moment, and I think in our own moment, the questions they raised were lived out in the choices of thousands of Black New Yorkers who had to decide whether to remain in a city that sometimes proved hostile to their presence. The struggle resonates powerfully today as New York and the nation again grapples with questions of belonging, of citizenship, of the right to make a home in a place where one's presence is contested. So when we walk these same streets, as New Yorkers today, I propose that we walk in the footsteps of those who fought to stay and those who were forced to leave, those who built institutions despite obstacles, and those who sought freedom across oceans, all of them shaping the complex legacy of the city we live in today. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Duane. As some have commented in the chat, great presentation. We're going to shift to Q&A, and I will turn the floor over to Melissa.
Thank you so much. This was a fantastic presentation. And we have a few questions that have come in. I think the first here is, what influenced Hamilton's attitude on the Black students of 1825 and on?
I'm sorry, what, could you say that again?
Sure, it looks like it's what influenced Hamilton's attitude to the Black students of 1825 and on?
I'm not sure about, Alexander Hamilton, I guess. Alexander Hamilton was a member of the New York Manumission Society, and thus was, a part of the club or the group, I should say, that created the school and supported the school until 1833, though I don't have a lot of evidence that he was super hands-on in the school's day-to-day functioning. But I think his attitude, like in the New York Manumission Society, was very conflicted, as we sort of saw with that one example I gave of the schoolmaster, in some ways, like really loving and supporting his students, but saying like, there's no place for you here. That we believe education is important for citizenship, but we can't really think beyond that. And so I think it was a very sort of conflicted, I wouldn't say that's Hamilton necessarily, but in terms of what was taught at the school, how people responded to the students, there was this really conflicted, like education is important, but we can't envision what you're going to do with it after, if that makes sense.
I think so. Thank you for that.
Of
And
course.
our next question is, how was it even possible for James Smith to learn about the University of Glasgow in his early years and subsequently apply and garner acceptance?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I really, that struck me. And one of the reasons I really wanted to write this book is because I think we have this belief that, things were completely closed down or that there was no possibility. It was, again, it wasn't a one-person job. He had a really strong sense of community. Peter Williams, who was a minister and would remain a mentor to both men really throughout his life. There was a large overseas network of abolitionists going back, like as I mentioned, Garnet would later go and work in the UK with, I didn't specify, but he worked for the Free Produce Society, which was an international organization that said basically we need to boycott all slave-made goods and only buy free produce. So there was this really vibrant transatlantic abolitionist network that served to, where people went back and forth and offered different opportunities. So I've never like quite tracked down like who sent the letter to who, but Glasgow was dedicated to being an abolitionist organization. They came across James McCune Smith. I'm sure he impressed them incredibly. By all accounts, he did. There's lots of interesting things of what he did at the school, but he won them all over. Incredibly, when he was coming back, actually, the captain wouldn't give him passenger passage. So like he'd spent all this time gaining the respect of these very powerful scientists and influential scientists. And then on his way back I've always thought like, he didn't have to go back. He's books passage and he gets told, well, you can't go on a passenger, get in steerage or something. And all of his former teachers and his colleagues absolutely protest and say absolutely not, and make sure that he gets home, with the dignity he should have. But again, like just that real sharp difference between what was possible overseas and what was possible here. So I think that there was a lot of opportunities. Frederick Douglass would also, spend time in the UK. So I think it was just part of that network.
Thank you for that. This might be a little easier, but what is the name of the New York regiment?
So there's the 20th and the 26th that come out of Rikers Island. The one that I'm describing there, they just say the 20th. I'm not sure if perhaps it was both. I kind of think it might have been both, but it was definitely the 20th and 26th that came out of New York.
Thank you. And you briefly mentioned a Black physician who had attended Columbia but did not receive a degree. What was his name, and can you say anything more about him?
Yes. I don't know that much more about him, and I wish I did. Okay, John Brown. And I believe if you went to the records of Columbia, I think that's where I found it. And this was not an uncommon practice, both for people of color and for women. You'd be allowed to sort of study, but you would never get a degree, and you were never counted as officials. So there was this weird halfway pact, like you would be able to have access to an education, but not the degree. So there were certainly African Americans who were practicing medicine, before and after Garnet, who did not have MDs, but not Garnet, I'm sorry, James McCune Smith. But James McCune Smith is the first to earn that degree.
Right. Thank you for that. And we have a direct message here from Eric K. Washington.
Oh, excellent.
Says, thank you for this wonderful presentation, and thank you for the unexpected shout out. Apparently it's a little dangerous to be chopping onions and get a shout out on a message here. Almost lopped off a finger, not fully. But about that etching that you showed of the African Free School by Patrick Reason, do you know if the line drawing of the school was also by him?
I will double check that. I believe so, but I want to check my records to make sure. I think so. I mean, he's also in a lot of the records because he's an incredible artist. I will go back and see where the line drawing is. I'm sorry that I don't know that offhand.
Good. What was the involvement of white churches in educating African American students?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I mean, the New York African free schools were in some ways an exception for the way a lot of Black New Yorkers or African Americans were getting their education in the early 19th century. Much more common was to have Sunday schools because for lots of reasons, among them, like you just needed to work during the week, and also many schools at this rate, it's a free school, which is really important because there were lots of schools. There wasn't really a robust public school system, so for almost everyone, school would often come with some kind of cost. So people were not able to, pay the fees and or lose their labor during the week. So they would attend Sunday schools. Many of these would be at white churches. Also Black churches, but it was quite often that they would have Sunday schools, which would give sort of very rudimentary reading and writing skills. And there's lots of accounts. There's one on Brooklyn that's amazing. They're sort of populating all over the city, and just the dedication of people who are exhausted. There's accounts, people would say how they would fall asleep. At these Sunday schools, you'd often have a mix of ages. So you'd have young children, but you'd also have adults who wanted to gain literacy. So in many of these schools and in lots of educational spaces, you really had this sort of intergenerational work of sometimes younger people helping the older folks because they may have actually had more access to literacy than their parents or grandparents might have had.
Thank you for that. And we have somebody who's just making a note to let everyone here know. For those who are local to New York City or visiting, the Bible from the Colored Orphan Asylum is on display at the New York Historical Society, along with a draft wheel.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't know that. I need to go over there. Yeah, the piece of embroidery that I posted earlier, that was also the New York Historical Society reached out to me and said, should we purchase this? I said, yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad that, and I think it's still on display in their children's museum. That actual tapestry you can see, and it does remind me. I didn't mention it in this presentation because I was focused on James McCune Smith and Henry Highland Garnet, but the New York African Free School was co-ed. That we have counts in the records. One valedictorian is a girl, and there are other girls who perform on these examination days as well. They were taught slightly different things, but this is a place where little girls and little boys were both learning.
It's wonderful. I think that's all we have for questions, unless anyone has a last one you want to ask. We have a lot of people who are really looking forward to reading the book, and people
excellent!
Love this presentation today.
Oh, thank you so much. there's one point I wanted to make, and I'll just make it really quickly because I think it's important about the school and how these students grew up. The school was run, they called it a Lancasterian method, which was basically for lack of funding and other reasons, philosophical reasons. They would have one schoolmaster, and basically you'd have students who were, they call them monitors, who would lead their groups. So students were teaching each other all day. It was student-led learning. Like the schoolmaster would say, these are the lessons, and it was your job as a monitor to make sure that your students in your group did well. And I just think that, again, I think inadvertently, I don't think that was their plan, created a space where Black children were seeing each other as authorities, as someone to learn from, and they developed their own capacity as leaders. So I don't know, for any educators out there, I just think it was really a remarkable model. And the students that came out of there just blew me away. Yes, it would make a wonderful miniseries. I think that they both need movies. I'm completely in favor. Garnet especially, but both of them. Garnet's especially sort of cinematic. But thank you everyone for your kind words. I'm at the University of Connecticut. If anyone wants to email me, I'd love to talk further.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Duane, again for hosting today's Lunch and Learn. If you're interested in purchasing Educated for Freedom and learning more about James McCune Smith and Henry Highland Garnet, we've included a link to the book in the chat. And thank you for joining us today. Be sure to join us next week for our next Lunch and Learn on digitizing the 1890 police census. So 1 week from today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.